Welcome to the Relationships Inside Out podcast with Doctors Gregory Siebert and Kimberly Murray, licensed marriage and family therapists. Join them on this journey as they explore the ins and outs of relationships.
Well, welcome to Relationships Inside Out, where today we're going to talk about how to discuss difficult news with families and to navigate their responses to traumatic news.
Not just traumatic news, but any type of hard conversation in that realm, right?
Yeah.
And how do we create space for someone? How do we deliver it well? How do we really engage in this process in an intentional and perhaps compassionate way?
Nobody likes giving news that's difficult, that we know might hurt someone, might cause them stress or trauma, depending on what the news is. Very, very difficult and something that none of us look forward to do. Even as a therapist, we don't like to.
No. And it puts you at risk of actual trauma yourself, because if someone's reaction is big, that can be a traumatic moment for the deliverer of that news.
One important thing that I think has to happen first before anything is, when we know we have to convey that, is regulate yourself.
Yeah.
Find a way to ground yourself. Get your place where you're regulating your own stress response system, so you can be in place to be more objective and think about how you might be, strategic in your approach in the best way possible, so it can land effectively for our loved ones.
And that's a privilege, depending on the type of news we're delivering. Sometimes we don't have that moment. So it's finding short ways to ground myself. It's 5 deep breaths. It is, okay, what do I need to say? Think through it really quick. If you don't have the time, you don't. That's a crisis situation, and you just got to say it. But in the chance you have even a minute, try to take that minute to get yourself together. If you're sobbing, if you're shaking, if you're having a hard time breathing, regulate that piece before entering into the next piece. Because again, too, if you're hyper aroused when you enter, your risk of trauma is then increased again.
And emotional contagion.
Yeah.
That visceral response, someone else might experience.
Because my fears may lead to theirs. Yeah.
Yeah. Before the news is even out, that the body's already preparing for that and responding to that, which isn't necessarily helpful. I mean, we can do our best. We're human, and we might not have the timing. But if you do, like those 5 quick breaths, or more sensation, like sense and savor, where you're focused on an object and just go in your mind all the details, like the weight of it, the texture, the smell, is there writing, what's the is there any sound to it, everything that you can think of, to really take your mind away from what's happening that's causing that stress, and just focus in the moment, just to be present, to help your stress response system regulate.
And then finding yourself support, right? Example, my mom died, and I've talked about this before. I had to share that with some family members. So getting my support before I took that time for myself to do that. Not long, just a few minutes. But then gave the news, and then took my support after. Really let myself, in my eyes, fall apart. Let myself lean into my husband. Do the things I needed to do to also acknowledge my experience, because it's not just about who I'm delivering to. It's also me as the deliverer.
Yeah. And in that case, you had time.
I did.
Which, like you talked about, sometimes we don't have that. And that's
like a car accident, or some sort of emergency with our child, or an immediate medical issue.
And this isn't to say that the other person's response is your responsibility.
Truth.
This is more about, these are the people we care about, and we want to do the best we can to communicate difficult news, and do it in a way that, in some cases, want to maintain the relationship. Because it's very hard. People respond to difficult news, I say like traumatic news, in very different ways.
Sure.
Some will blame, right? They're grieving and they blame. They have to find a reason of why that happened and make sense of it.
I think of it as like shrapnel from grief.
Yeah.
Right? When I go into grief and then I explode, who's going to catch my shrap?
Yeah. And we don't have control if that's going to happen or not. Nope. And so part of why it's important to regulate ourselves is so we can objectively recognize that and not personalize the responses, and to be able to support them even through that. Because if we've had time, we've already done our process.
This includes things even like sharing that we're getting a divorce, including with our children.
That's tough. Yeah.
That's one where we can take many moments, even seek consultation, seek guidance, and we can be intentional about timing, intentional about the words used, the tone we use, the bodily presence we bring into the room, the support that's available for the listening party, specifically if it's a child, right?
Yeah.
Having that on hand. Those moments are give us that ability to be super intentional. And if you have that ability, take it, because it can help reduce some of that strap after. Not necessarily,
Yeah.
but it increases our chances of that.
I mean, it's just tough. I mean, this is why we're talking about this right now is we're given some sense of things you can do, but there's a lot of uncertainty in this process because we don't necessarily know or can control how people are going to respond. You do talk about children. So I think it'd be important to talk about what language you might even use with children, depending on the developmental level. I mean, obviously honesty builds trust. So we want to be honest. We don't want to beat around the bush. We don't have to go into details or graphics or things like that. And this includes like, cancer diagnosis and things like that.
Death is a big one where I soapbox on, because say it's a pet's a big deal to people of all ages, including kids. Using phrases like, we're going to put the dog to sleep. Child thinks sleep, and we have two risks there. One, they're like, oh, well, then Sparky's going to wake up.
Yeah.
But two, if I go to sleep, am I going to die? It's a very risky phrase, friends.
Yeah.
Instead, we're going to say death, died. We're going to use those concrete words and explain that, not these cute terms that we try to wrap them up in. We often use those phrases to soften it out of love, out of compassion. And kids, much like adults, actually need a fairly direct approach, need you to stick to facts.
Concrete.
The difference between kids and adults is the amount of detail, the questions that we might be asked or answer. That's going to look different, right? Am I going to tell, like if someone died in a car accident, am I going to tell my daughter the nitty gritty of that? No, absolutely not.
Maybe not even an adult, because the vicarious trauma, right?
Some adults might ask, and I might answer. If my daughter asked, I'm going to keep it real plain, right? But I'm still going to be direct at how they passed.
Yeah.
I'm still going to be direct with her that they have died. Again, that language is super important. With the cancer thing, my father-in-law has cancer, and my daughter's aware of it, my oldest. And we talked to her about that. So when she hears someone else has cancer, because it just seems to be everywhere, we talked to her about the differences in those. We talked to her about how it can mean different things for different bodies. Or one of her friends lost a parent to cancer. Talking to her about, just because Papa has cancer does not mean he's going to die. It's a different kind, right? So answering those questions so her mind isn't left to wander, but also being concrete and factual.
Yeah. And when we're talking about family response, that includes our own response. We might be the one receiving the news. And this is where we have to regulate before we respond, if we can. And sometimes we don't know. More importantly, give yourself grace, because it might caught us off guard. The people who are sharing it might not actually take some of the things we're talking about now and do it in a way that can land softly. There can be curiosity. There can be support in the process, because not everyone's a professional, but even professionals can struggle with the.
Oh, absolutely. Especially when we're in crisis. We lose that beautiful prefrontal cortex that has our rational, reasonable, planful thinking.
Yeah. And I think grace is really important around this, because we all respond in different ways and respond ways that we're not proud of. There is a difference if that continues to prolong. I think about in the case where somebody blames somebody else for like their cancer.
Sure.
And it's like, well, that's not realistic, but they hold on to that. And
or the death of a family member, or an illness, or even divorce, where parents get mad at their children for making that choice, or the spouse's partner, and then talk to their grandchildren about how their dad or mom is a piece of shit. We see this all the time.
And you can't heal if you don't have grace for each person's response. Because now we're too worried about being disrespected, being blamed. And instead, if we give grace and compassion for the response, then we're able to actually then provide support.
Even boundaries. Like, I know this is really hard for you, and here's my boundary, and I need space, and yada, yada, right?
It takes a lot. Like
this is not as easy as we make it sound, because talking about it is so much different. Right now, I have full access to my whole brain.
Yeah.
I can reasonably, rationally think through this. I can plan for this, but I can tell you the way I responded to my mom, not at all how I expected to respond. Right?
Yeah.
Some people might go numb, might dissociate, might be like, I don't not even feel it. Yeah. Others might buckle at the knees and sob. We've seen people pass out. We have seen people scream and get mad, throw things. There's a whole variety of reactions depending on the news, the
Yeah.
context, how close they were with that person. Again, not just death, but divorce, medical issues, major turmoil, cutoffs, things like this.
And society loves to put narratives of how things should look.
Oh, absolutely.
It shoulds on us, right? And it's okay if you don't respond in a way that you thought you were going to. It's okay if the family member doesn't respond in a way that you think is
best.
best.
We like to call it best, right?
It doesn't matter. Everyone responds to this differently. And there's no time on this stuff, depending on what the
No.
news is and what the grieving process looks like. There's no time. Putting those expectations and narratives on others put this added pressure. I have multiple clients who beat themselves up because they didn't cry leading up to the anticipatory loss of a loved one, or they're not crying in the way that people thought that they should. Or then you have other people who say, just go exercise. It's like, do you?
Even the attendance of a funeral or a wake. Or do you want to be there when that person passes?
Yeah.
When we're talking about hard news, it's not just the moment in which we share the news, it's that cascading of events afterwards. And how I'm going to respond is going to be vastly different than Joe Blow, right? Like for me, being there for the death, the wake, actually freaks me out. It is not at all what I want to be a part of, and it creates more trauma for me.
Yeah.
Other people, that's a part of their closure. That's a part of their culture. It's important to them.
Yeah.
It's important that I respect them and they respect me, because how we handle it, I don't want to put it, as you were just saying, that should box. You should want to be with them. You should want to see them. You should whatever. You should stay married. You should stay in the state of Colorado because that's where your in-laws are.
You should be the one that gives a eulogy.
Yes.
You should be ashamed of yourself because of what you did led to your mom having cancer.
You
Right?
should stop crying.
Yeah. You should be over this already.
Oh, and that's hard, right? We see people who grieve for years. Gosh, they haven't moved on yet.
Man, you're still dealing with that?
Oh.
Oh.
Or you already moved on. Did you even care about them?
Yeah.
Like my mom's grief, I grieve for a bit, but it doesn't punch me in the same way it punches my siblings. Like they are still very much deep in the pain and the depression. I'm not.
Yeah.
And they're different processes. And can we allow for that? Or do we judge one another for that? Do we look at each other and say, like, you're still doing that? Or clearly you didn't love her.
Especially, and what's very difficult about this,
yeah,
when we're talking about reactions and how we respond and whether we can give grace, is when you see them doing unhealthy things to cope.
Oh, yes. Very much
like
so.
substance use or things that, because there's this whole idea of like, you should be over this by now. But then there's this real thing of you shouldn't be drowning yourselves in alcohol or what the unhealthy stuff. That's even difficult news to break, is we don't think that this is the best way to cope with this.
We're worried about you.
And I wouldn't even say that. It'd be, how can we help you? How can we support you? What are you needing right now? Do you think what you're doing right now is helpful? And curiosity is key here, in my opinion, rather than having any statement or question that would indicate that you are putting shame on their process, because we know it's unhealthy and we don't know what they're needing to change that or adapt that or what led to that.
There's no right way. There's no right way to talk about it. There's no right way to experience it.
I mean, there's unhealthy ways.
Sure, there are ways that can make it worse.
Yeah.
But it compounds too, right? How I hear the news can impact my reaction afterwards. How I react or the trauma that's received can impact my risk of substance use, my risk of prolonged depression, all of those pieces. It can.
Yeah.
And so when we can be intentional, we can help mitigate. Again, to your point, it doesn't mean we're responsible for the reaction, but if we have that ability to even soften it a millimeter, it's worth that effort for both, right? Because if I can help soften, their reaction might not be as, I don't want to say volatile, but maybe as reactionary, maybe as intense. And therefore it might not be as hard on me. It's still hard, but it doesn't feel as traumatic or painful or intense.
And it also doesn't mean that you have to give up all your boundaries and support, because
absolutely,
it is important to regulate yourself to get to a point where you can even talk about this, given that you have time potentially, right? And to be able to provide support for the loved ones. But that doesn't mean that you don't need boundaries around your own process. Because if you don't, and you're taking care of everybody else, then you're not really processing through it yourself.
What can be hard about hard news too is what I see as hard or difficult may not be to someone else. Or I may think like, oh, it's not, I mean, it's big, but it's not that big, right? Like, hey, in-laws, I'm moving. I've seen this with clients. We're moving to Wyoming.
Yeah.
And they think their parents will be like, oh, okay. We can't wait to see your new home. And instead, their parents are, how could you leave us? How could you abandon us? You are so selfish.
Yep.
And it
Traumatic.
wrecks that relationship, right? So these decisions aren't just about devastating news. Sometimes it's just news of growth, news of change, news that,
It's subjective though in some cases.
yeah, news that her daughter doesn't want to be a doctor. I know you guys had hoped she would be. She's chosen to go into art instead.
Yeah. For some
That could be huge.
some parents and their culture, that could be traumatic.
Massive.
Yeah. Well, I think about when I got the news that my mom had breast cancer. This is several years ago now. I did not respond the way I thought I would. I didn't shed a tear. I was, I attribute it to my military and like numbing, responding. My parents were both crying to share the news. They were both sad, and we're sharing that and sitting together. And I remember it, and I still am like, I didn't respond in any way. And granted, I probably went into a protective state for myself. But I started asking questions like, oh, well, where are we at? What's the stage?
The logical part.
Went into that logical stuff, which is very probably military and also self-protective.
Self-protective.
But there's also a part of me that typically isn't self-protective in certain news, and I will cry. So it's just very interesting. Like even me trained in this field, I didn't even know how to respond or that I was going to respond. I thought I would do it in a certain way, and it wasn't. So there's giving myself grace that I didn't respond in the best way. And my parents never said a thing about it. They didn't say that you were numb or hardened, because some people who don't cry or don't do the things that people anticipate, they get judged. And it's like, no, this is how they're responding. It could be self-protective. And I work with several clients who are still working on trying to forgive their family or family members or close ones or friends because they didn't respond in a way that they felt was validating or empathetic. And that's a big one, is the ones who don't respond in a way that you should look like.
Because it doesn't measure that intensity. Sometimes we associate intensity with care. If you don't give me an intense response back, you don't care.
It's a barometer, right?
It doesn't matter to you. But also if it's too intense, sometimes in grief, we wail. We make sounds we wouldn't otherwise make. We're like, oh my gosh, they're overly dramatic. They went too far.
Yeah.
And it's almost like we have to have this sweet spot.
Yeah.
Which is kind of jacked up, that we tell people these really hard moments in which your brain is going to fully shut down. We need you to respond this way.
And this is tough from a clinician standpoint, because I have, whether I want to or not, have my own idea of how this process should look like. And then I have clients who might grieve for 24 hours and it's over for them.
Kids are that way.
And I'm like, that doesn't seem. And then I have clients who we've been together grieving for a year and a half.
Yep.
And it's like, it's letting go of my own expectations in the clinical sense. I have to do that in my own personal life too, because maybe they are over it. Maybe they are. Maybe that's what they need.
Maybe that's okay.
And maybe that's okay.
Kids, we see the same thing, where kids, especially the younger they are, their reaction, they may be like, okay. Or they may cry for a minute and they'll be like, can we go play Legos now? And for parents, that can be really jarring of, wait, what? Just told you your grandma died. I thought you loved her. And having to coach parents around, that's actually developmentally pretty appropriate for them to not sit in that pain for very long.
Yeah.
And even to then a day later be like, where's grandma? And bring it back up. Kids don't process all in one chunk, nor do adults. And can we love our kids through that? Right? Can we say, how are you doing? Oh, I'm fine. Okay. Not saying like, you're not sad. Why are you not sad? Saying like, okay, have you thought about grandma? How are you doing with that? When they are sad, loving them through it rather than trying to distract them out of it.
Yeah.
Because it's hard. It is hard as adults. Imagine how it is for a little brain, where they don't have relative experience of death and loss and pain, where they don't have a roadmap of coping skills. They literally are just going off of instinct at that point.
And how different someone else's response is to what you think it should be causes distress. And a lot of that distress we're experiencing is what drives us to want to control other people's grieving process. Don't. Manage your own stress around it. Be curious of why it even bothers you that they're taking a while to cope, or that they didn't cope long enough. Did that mean they don't love that person? or they don't care about that they just got diagnosed with cancer, whatever. It may not be helpful. The response may not be helpful for what you need in that moment.
But
And
that's on you. It's not on them to perform.
and if your I guess well-being or your response is contingent upon someone else's response, that's not good.
True.
Like if you needed them to respond in a certain way so you can have them in your life and be healthy, but instead they distance and shut down to go cope, and now you have no one to do it with, that sucks. And we have to find another way that isn't contingent or dependent upon the other person.
So let's give some like practical how-tos. What do I say? I hear people say that to me all the time as a clinician. And some clinicians would turn that question around and say, well, what do you think you should say? If someone's asking me that question, they don't know the answer. I'm not going to leave them on the lurch. So I often try to help. And I say, like, this is just kind of what I would say. Please adapt it, right?
Yeah.
So step one.
Regulate yourself.
Yeah. Before you even pick up that phone, find your own inner peace if there's time.
The second thing I do is I check in with where that person's at and if they're in a place that they can talk about something that might be tough.
So you're getting their buy-in. You're saying, hey, Bob,
you're checking your capacity too.
Yeah. Are you alone? Are you
not driving?
Right. Please do not do while someone's driving.
Yeah.
Are you sitting in a quiet, safe, or alone place? Are you in a place where we can talk about something big or hard? Right? Some people might say, like, no, but tell me anyway. Encourage Bob to go find that space if Bob needs to do that, right? Before you deliver it. If they're driving, you risk them actually having physical injury to themselves or another. Please do not do it while someone's driving or operating machinery or in any way at risk.
And this is why you regulating before is important, because we don't want you sharing that news with other people to be your stress relieving process.
Like the urgency.
Because it will drive the urgency to say it anyways. And people will pressure you, even though if you sense that they're not in a place, they're busy, they got distracted, things like that. And they just want to know because of how you presented it. Just say, we'll talk about it here in a little bit. Call me tonight when you're, or later.
Or why don't you head to your office? Let's talk. If they want to know now, I respect that. Can you go somewhere private, please? Right? We're not just going to say, okay, well, I'll tell you now. I had a client whose parent did that to her, withheld that someone had died, and then told her in a very public place. And she was devastated because she broke down in a very public place. And now people are staring. Now people are judging, reacting. And that added to the intensity of that moment for her.
Yeah. I mean, be very conscious of this place. This is why we have to be regulated the best we can.
Yep.
Granted, the timing of everything and what we need to say. Because unfortunately, there's just situations like a car accident where somebody calls, they have to call because they have to.
We just got to get it out.
Yeah. And the person not in the ambulance is still alive, but they're unconscious and they need the parent to identify.
Yeah.
Or they need to call the emergency contact. So there isn't time.
Right.
So, and I've had clients where their friends were with them in a car and their friend had to call their parents, right? I mean, it's just, you don't have the time.
You don't have the time.
Sometimes. And that's tough. There's not much control over that. If you can do what you said earlier, like the 5 breaths, things like that, that would be key. Or take a brief moment to ground yourself, whatever that looks like. That's going to be essential. But then going back to how do we talk about it? Now, when delivering the news, it depends on what news you're delivering. Like I think about a divorce thing. It might be beneficial to cushion it with validation.
And do it when they're not at work. If it's something like divorce and you have time, maybe in person, maybe over the phone, doesn't matter. Wait until they're at home and have room.
And this is considering that there's a dynamic where you can even have a conversation about it. Because sometimes it might be a point where there's like, here's the papers, from somebody, third party. But if there is a conversation to be had and you want to talk about it and explore it, and maybe it's not even divorce, maybe it's I'm losing attraction. There might be validation.
We're talking about between partners,
between partners too, right? And so it might be validation around like, I love this, I love that when it happens, I'm having difficulty here. Validation might be key in those instances.
Whereas the more traumatic or crisis ones, cut to the point. I cannot say this enough, right? Sometimes I've heard clients, and I've been in this position myself, where the person who's delivering is giving me all the background. And in my mind, I'm like, and
yeah,
cut to the point and then give the details.
Yeah.
Not the other way around. Sometimes we want to explain everything and then give the punchline. And what that does actually creates more anxiety and puts us at risk of an even more intense reaction.
And it's us truly avoiding having to give the news.
Oh, yeah.
And details might not be appropriate.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Whether age or just them sparing the details could, reserve the trauma. And down the road, in a place where both are calm and this has passed a little bit, maybe you sit down and say, those details would really help me. And then you can explore that.
And then I often encourage use their name. That is a grounding tool, to use a name. It means that we are here together, not just a nebulous. And then we cut straight to the point. Bob, your mom died, right? And that's hard. Woof, even that, sucker punch, right? Give Bob a minute to respond. Don't immediately be like, are you okay? No, Bob's not okay. That question is never helpful, by the way, after a crisis, because they're not okay.
Yeah.
Instead, pivot to, Bob, I can imagine this is really hard for you to hold.
Empathize.
How can I support you? Can I send you support? Do you need someone to come get you? Whatever it might be. Children are no different. Harper, your grandma died. And letting her have a minute, letting her process, maybe even giving her a hug. Maybe it's not words at all.
Yeah.
But reading that room with her.
Yeah. And asking the simple question, what are you needing right now?
Yeah.
I try to stay away from what are you feeling right now? Because there's a lot of people who don't use emotions to identify their experience.
Or there's 15 emotions at once.
And they don't have the language for it. So what do you need right now? And they might not know. You might even label that specifically. Be like, would it be helpful if I put my arm around you? Would it be helpful if I held your hand?
Do you want a hug?
Do you want a hug? Can I take you somewhere? Can I get you something? And label it. Because when somebody's flooded with all this information and all the emotions, like you said, 15 emotions going on with this news, they're not maybe going to be able to identify because they might be in shock. I know in times where I've been in shock, I couldn't even tell, the emergency crews where I lived, even though I was standing right outside the building. Right. I was like, what floor was I on? And you're just not there.
You're not there.
So.
And I've seen too, where people, perhaps that same conversation, that same day, will then call me and be like, okay, so what are we going to do about the funeral? Please don't do that to your loved one. Give them a minute to even accept the truth that has been given to them before going into logistics, before pushing them outside of that into what's going to be a really hard space.
Yeah. Be curious. Where are you at with it? Like you're talking about the space might be in hard space. So if you have a question for somebody, wait, check in first to see where they're at. If you have a question of when's the funeral or are they doing cremation? We don't believe in that. Why are they doing that?
Give some grace in this process. Give time, give breath. It feels urgent because we have anxiety, we have fear, we have pain. And so it creates urgency. But often, barring the crisis like a car accident or a medical emergency, it's not as urgent as we make it, especially in death. There are some cultural customs where the person has to be buried or the religious ceremony has to happen within 2 or 3 days. That there is a little bit of urgency, but still try to give room. Try to give them a sense to process. And after the funeral or after the crisis or whatever, give them room to process, room to breathe.
And for those where the situation is maybe around the loss of someone, don't start the conversation of who's getting what.
Oh, geez, Pete's.
I don't know why this happens. And it happens
every
so
time.
Much. Wait, so who's getting those fishing rods? Wait, so
when are we going through mom stuff?
Who's the executor? Yeah, when are we going through the stuff? And it's like
time.
Wait, be curious, check in. When will you have time to talk about X? Like, we don't have to do it now. Where are you at? Just at least check in.
I've had clients, even somewhat to my own narrative, where siblings have gone through things.
Oh, before without telling anyone either.
Or when they come for the funeral, all of a sudden they're going through all of parents' stuff or whatever. It's devastating. As the receiver of that, I'm here to tell you it's devastating.
Yeah.
Because it rushes that process. So now I feel like I have to be somewhere I'm not ready to be. But it also, now I'm distracted from the loss and I'm focusing on, you want to take what now? And this bullshit dynamic we create of ego, of greed, of desire.
And this one is tricky because I see it in the way that you just talked about. Yeah. And I also see it as a reaction to how someone copes. Because they want to grab these things because they still want to live with this person through these things.
The connection, sure.
And so it's tough because then if there's multiple people that need stuff for connection, like this is where you get conflict. And so part of it is a grieving process in some regard.
Sure.
And so I see that, and it's like, then you got to have a difficult conversation around that of like, I understand you need these things. Can we wait? Please, can we wait till we can talk about this? Like, God, this is unfortunately contingent upon sibling relationships and those dynamics. This is very tough. So we're just giving more of a blanket general.
Well, grief brings out sometimes the sides of people you never knew existed. The dark, the urgent, the blaming. And it's not necessarily a reflection of the person. It can be, but sometimes it's just the brain doesn't know how to cope. And so it clings on to any point of control that it can possibly grab.
Yeah.
Right. If I can tell you I'm taking this stuff, now I've got control. I've got a piece that's for me. I get to protect myself. Whereas the nebulous of what are we going to do with this stuff? What are the next steps? We don't really like that. We like to have that control or predictability.
And this is where, in a time when you feel you can and have the capacity to do so, is feel if you can have grace for someone and forgive them and conceptualize that was a response. Again, there's things like, well, they're still continuing to engage in this 2 years later. You know, obviously we're going to have to be realistic with ourselves and boundaries, and maybe they're still not dealing with it in that way. But I think it's a continual observation and exploration on your end to see if they're at a place where you can have a conversation around this, or is this truly who they are?
And in any case, get support. If you don't know how to handle something, if you're feeling overwhelmed, if you're feeling urgent, if you don't know how to talk to your kids, your family member, whatever about it, get support. There are people who can help guide in this, that have done this themselves, that have guided other people, have training in this area.
Yeah. And I love that, because then you can go to a therapist and you can work on what that response looks like. Again, if you have time, and maybe this difficult conversation is trying to repair, because repair is really important in this process.
Oh yeah.
Like, we all do some shitty things, I'm sure, in times of crisis.
Oh yeah.
And whether to us it's shitty, but it might be shitty to somebody else, depending on what their expectations were around it, like we talked about. So working with a therapist to find ways we can repair this, and how do we navigate this specific conversation based on who these people are. It can be more tailored than what we're kind of really talking about here.
Oh yeah. Especially with things like divorce. I often encourage couples that are seeking separation or divorce. Let's talk about how to do that well. Let's get your kids into support now, so that when you share, they've already got support established. They've already got that rapport.
Yeah.
But also, as a couple, yes, you're not going to do couples therapy in terms of repair, in terms of healing the marriage, but you're going to do co-parenting therapy.
Yeah.
You're going to do partner-based therapy of, okay, we're not married anymore, but we still have to raise these little, I call them shitlins, together, right?
Yeah. Granted, they're both wanting that, and there isn't like cases of like
absolutely
abuse.
Fair point.
Yeah.
But that can help, because what we know in research from divorce, a little bit of a tangent, divorce itself is not harmful to children. This is a big belief in our culture that divorced kids are screwed. It's not true. What harms children is how the parents are before, during, and after the divorce.
Absolutely.
Not the physical splitting of households. So if I can keep it amicable with my partner in front of my kids before, during, and after, my kids are going to have to adjust. There's a change that's going to happen. But their risk of poor outcomes later that we see with divorce, very low. It's when it's contentious, when there's a parent weaponizing kids, right? Or we blurt it out at our kids. Again, that sharing of news. When we can be intentional, thoughtful, reasonable to the audience, all the better.
Yeah.
And know your audience, right? Not necessarily in divorce, but in other ways. In divorce too, but I even said as we were prepping for this episode to Greg, like for me, I'm blunt. I need you to just give it to me. Don't give me the extra fluff, the extra bullshit that irritates me and makes me more volatile in my reaction. Just say it. Other people need that softening. They need that fluff. They need that cushion. And blunt would actually be harmful for them. So if you know your audience, try to give in the way you think they'll best receive.
Yeah.
Oof. Okay. So tough conversations. They happen not just in families that we focus on today, but friendships, our children, even our coworkers, quitting a job. There is a delicate way to do this when we have the opportunity.
Yeah.
So this has been Relationships Inside Out, where today we talked about how to have some difficult conversations with those that we care about. As always, if anyone has questions, topic suggestions, anything like that, feel free to email us at relationshipsinsideout@gmail.com. Thanks.
Thanks.